I'm Laurel, 32, a captain in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Exactly 72 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, the phone rang. My father was on the other end. In a flat, clinical voice, like he was canceling a dentist appointment, he said 6 words. I am not walking you down. The reason? My sister Vanessa is going through a messy divorce, and seeing me in a wedding dress would trigger her. To soothe his favorite daughter, he threw me away. 10 minutes later, my mother followed up. No apology, just a command. Go alone, don't make a scene. Modern brides do it all the time. They expected me to swallow the bitterness to save the family's face. They were wrong. When those chapel doors finally swing open, the man on my arm is going to make my father's world collapse. Before I show you how I stripped him of his fatherhood right there at the altar. Drop a comment and let me know which state you're watching from. Like and subscribe if you've ever realized the biggest traitors share your last name. The barn was filled with the skeletons of my mother's expectations. White lace tablecloths draped over rusted farm equipment like silk shrouds. It was 1400 hours and the sun was a pale, weak disk behind the thick Lake Erie clouds. My hands, calloused and mapped with small scars from engine grease and tactical drills, felt like heavy, clumsy tools as I adjusted a bouquet of baby's breath. I'm a soldier. I'm used to the grit of the motor pool, the heat of the desert, and the cold logic of an engineering schematic. This world of tool and fragile glass felt like a minefield I wasn't equipped to sweep. The phone buzzed. It was a violent vibration against the plywood staging table, rattling a jar of pearl-headed pins. I didn't want to touch it. My fingers were sticky with floral adhesive and the dust of a dozen centerpieces. I swiped the screen with the side of my elbow. Richard, I said. No, Dad. Not today. The silence on the other end was thick, heavy with the kind of cowardice that makes a man's throat go dry. I could hear his breathing, shallow, hitching, the sound of someone who had already decided to retreat before the first shot was even fired. Laurel, he started. His voice was a thin rasp, lacking any of the authority he used to pretend he had. I can't do it. I am not walking you down. I stood there, frozen. My boots felt like they were bolted to the concrete floor. My calves locked up instantly, a hard stabbing knot of muscle, the exact same physiological response I had back in the sandbox when I heard the metallic click of a pressure plate under a truck tire. Pure muscle memory. The brain senses the blast before the ears even process the noise. Why? I asked. My voice was a dead thing, stripped of all inflection. Your sister, he muttered, his voice trailing off into a pathetic whine. Vanessa. She's in a bad way, Laurel. The debt from that MBA is crushing her. The divorce from Preston is getting ugly. She says seeing you up there, playing the happy bride in front of the whole town, it's a slap in the face. She threatened to keep the grandkids away for Christmas if I show up at the chapel. He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He didn't offer a compromise or an apology. He just cut the line. A coward's exit. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a mocking electronic buzz that sounded like a funeral dirge for my childhood. I didn't have time to breathe before the screen lit up again. Donna, the commanding officer of the Ruiz household. She didn't call to offer a shoulder. She called to enforce the new perimeter. Your father told you, she said, skipping the greeting entirely. Good. We need to keep things quiet, Laurel. Vanessa is spiraling. She's fragile right now. You? You're the strong one. You've always been. Don't be selfish about this. Selfish? The word lodged itself deep in my sternum. It hit my chest like a stray round. I looked down at my scarred knuckles. I had spent my life being the strong one. I had given up my childhood bedroom so Vanessa could have a yoga studio for a phase that lasted 3 weeks. I had signed over my entire college savings account so she could chase an Ivy League degree she never used, while I signed my life away to the Army to pay for my own. I had spent my 20s in the dirt and the heat so she could live in a suburban house our parents helped finance, And now I was being ordered to surrender my wedding day because she couldn't handle the sight of someone else's stability. Is that all, Mother? I asked. Just walk yourself in. Wear something modest. Don't make a scene. We'll be there for the dinner later, but we can't be part of the ceremony. It's for the best. She hung up too. I sat down on a crate of mason jars. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the expensive centerpieces against the barn walls. Anger in the military is a resource. You don't waste it on noise. You channel it into the mission. I grabbed a spool of jute rope from the table. It was thick, brown, and abrasive. I started wrapping it around my palm, tighter and tighter. The coarse fibers bit into the scars on my knuckles. I pulled until the skin turned white, then a deep, angry red. I wanted the physical sting. I needed something sharp to anchor the dissociation that was threatening to turn my vision into gray static. A single tear burned the corner of my eye. I didn't let it fall. I blinked hard, forcing the salt back into the ducts. A soldier doesn't give the enemy the satisfaction of seeing a leak in the hull. I stood up and walked out onto the porch. The wind from Lake Erie swept in, sharp enough to draw blood. It carried the smell of rain, industrial rust, and wet sand. Across the street, a neighbor was out on his driveway. A guy in a grease-stained t-shirt running alongside a little girl on a bike with pink tassels. He was holding the back of her seat, laughing as she wobbled. He was there, present, solid. A father. I felt something inside me finally snap. It wasn't a loud break. It was the sickening sound of a structural beam shearing under too much weight. They had called me strong for 32 years just so they could pile their baggage on my back. They used my resilience as an excuse to starve me of affection. They thought I was a machine that didn't need maintenance. I looked back inside the barn. On a shelf near the door sat an old, silver-framed photo. Me at 22, in my dress blues, standing between Richard and Donna. They were smiling. I looked like I was holding the world up on my shoulders. I walked over, picked up the frame, and turned it face down on the dusty wood. The strong one was done taking orders. If they wanted to treat my life like a tactical sacrifice, fine. In the Army, when you abandon your post during a crisis, it's called desertion. And I knew exactly how to handle deserters. I pulled out my phone and dialed Marcus. Change of plans, I said when he picked up. My voice was steady, cold. We're not doing it their way. The game of being the victim was over. It was time for a counteroffensive. The wind off Lake Erie doesn't just blow, it bites. It's a wet, industrial cold that smells like rusted iron and dead fish. I stood on the porch, my knuckles still white from gripping that jute rope, watching the neighbor teach his kid to ride that bike. The scene was too clean, too perfect. It felt like a movie from a country I didn't belong to. I closed my eyes and let the cold pull me back to Ridgewood. Back to when the map of this war was first drawn. I was 14. That summer, the humidity in Ohio felt like a wet wool blanket. Vanessa was 17, the sun around which my parents' world rotated. She was at the mall with Mom, picking out a dress for some party. I was in the backyard, knee-deep in a trench I dug behind the garage. I wasn't playing, I was building. I'd spent weeks scavenging the neighborhood. I found scrap plywood behind the new construction down the street. I hauled rusted sheets of corrugated tin from the junkyard 3 miles away, carrying them until my shoulders bled. My fingernails were permanently black with Ohio clay. I was building a survival bunker. A place that was mine. A place where the noise of Vanessa's drama couldn't reach. I remember the smell of the damp earth and the sharp, metallic scent of the tin. I was hammer drilling a support beam when my father walked out. He didn't look at the structural integrity. He didn't see the way I'd braced the walls to handle the weight of the dirt. He just looked at the pile of wood. "Laurel," he said. He didn't even take his hands out of his pockets. "You're making a mess. Don't ruin your mother's lawn with that junk." He didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just turned around and went back inside to wait for the golden child to come home with her shopping bags. That was the pattern. Vanessa was the art on the wall. I was the foundation under the floorboards. Necessary, but better if I stayed out of sight. 7 years later, the contrast became a blinding light. It was the week I commissioned as a second lieutenant. I had spent 4 years earning that rank. I'd survived ruck marches until my feet were a mass of blisters. I'd spent nights in the freezing rain, studying maps by red light. I had earned my degree on a scholarship that required me to give the government my next 8 years. That same week, Vanessa brought home a thick, cream-colored envelope. She'd been accepted into the MBA program at Columbia. I remember sitting in the living room when Richard took out his checkbook. He didn't hesitate. He wrote a check for $22,000 for the first semester like he was signing a birthday card. He looked at her with a kind of reverence, a pride so thick it made the air in the room hard to breathe. "A leader," he whispered. "Our Vanessa is going to be a leader of industry." The dinner that night was a coronation. Richard stood up 3 times to give toasts. He talked about Columbia. He talked about Ivy League traditions. He talked about Vanessa's brilliance. I sat at the far end of the long oak table, wearing my Class A uniform. The silver bars on my shoulders felt like they weighed 100 pounds. I was a ghost at my own table. My commissioning, the fact that I was now an officer in the United States Army, wasn't even a footnote. I was just the girl who'd signed up to play soldier. Halfway through the meal, I went into the kitchen to get more ice. The swinging door didn't close all the way. I heard my mother's voice. She was talking to my Aunt Ruth. "She chose that life," Donna said, her voice dropping to that sharp, judgmental stage whisper. "All that military business, crawling in the mud, carrying guns. It's just not feminine, Ruth. It's hard to look at her and see a woman sometimes. I just wish she had a little bit of Vanessa's grace, just a fraction." I stood there in the dark of the kitchen, the ice bucket cold against my palms. I didn't drop it. I didn't walk out and scream. I just stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. The darkness felt honest. It didn't ask me to be graceful. It just let me be invisible. I realized then that I was a machine to them. A sturdy, reliable piece of equipment that didn't need oiling or maintenance. You don't praise a hammer for hitting a nail. You just expect it to work until the head snaps off. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your family, the one who does all the work while someone else gets all the credit, hit that like button. Comment the word invisible below, so I know you're with me. It's time we stopped hiding in the shadows. Subscribe to the channel because the counteroffensive is just getting started. Back on the porch in the present day, I looked at my phone. The screen was dark now. Richard and Donna had made their choice. They had deserted. But as I stood there, the tactical side of my brain, the officer side, started clicking into gear. I'd spent years in intelligence. I knew how to read a battlefield. Vanessa had the Ivy League degree. She had the banker husband. She had the grace and the grandkids. She was the one who was supposed to be winning. If she had everything, why was she so desperate to kill my wedding? Why was a captain's ceremony in a barn such a threat to her perfect life? A perfect person doesn't need to sabotage their sister. Only a drowning person tries to pull someone else under. I looked at the house across the street again. The little girl had fallen off her bike. Her father was already there, picking her up, dusting off her knees. I didn't have a father like that. I had Richard. And Richard had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He forgot that when you train someone to be a soldier, you shouldn't be surprised when they eventually declare war. Vanessa is hiding something. And I'm going to find the crack in her porcelain world and drive a tank through it. Why is she so afraid of me? The wind off Lake Erie didn't care about my wedding plans. It just wanted to strip the paint off the siding and remind me I was alone on this porch. I stood there, eyes tracking the gray horizon, but my brain was already back in Ridgewood, back in the trenches of the Ruiz dining room. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a scout behind enemy lines, mapping the rot before the structure finally gave way. Vanessa always thought she was the one with the power. She played the Ivy League card like it was an ace of spades, but I saw the truth. She was a hollowed-out tree, waiting for a stiff breeze to knock her over. Her only real weapon was the con tin, Lily and Owen. My father, Richard, was a man who had survived 30 years in a factory just to become a lapdog in his own house. He was terrified of the quiet. He was terrified that if he didn't bark when Vanessa told him to, she'd block his number and keep the grandkids away for Christmas. It was a hostage situation, and Richard was the guy paying his own ransom every single day. I remembered last Thanksgiving. The smell of the roasted turkey was cloying, thick enough to choke on. The house was decorated to the teeth. Expensive wreaths, fine china, the kind of keep up with the Joneses crap that cost more than my first truck. But the air was heavy. It felt like standing in a room full of gas with a guy flicking a lighter. Preston sat across from me, Vanessa's banker husband, the guy who wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage but couldn't look his own wife in the eye. He was mentally checked out, a ghost at the table. His thumbs were a rhythmic, frantic blur on his phone screen. Tap, tap, tap. I counted. 11 times in 30 minutes. He was hunting for an exit, and he didn't care who saw him looking. The silence at that table was a physical weight. We were all performing. Richard was smiling too wide. Donna was hovering, adjusting the silverware like it could fix the foundation. Nobody spoke until Lily, 5 years old and too honest for her own good, pointed a silver fork at her father. "Why do you always take pillows to the office to sleep lately, Daddy?" The vacuum sealed over the room instantly. My mother dropped a serving spoon. The clatter against the floor sounded like a gunshot. I looked at Vanessa, the golden child. The woman who looked down at my grease-stained hands and my army uniform like I was something she scraped off her shoe. Her jaw locked so tight I thought I heard the bone click. The expensive foundation on her face, that high-coverage mask she used to hide the sleepless nights, looked like it was peeling off a condemned building. She wasn't a leader of industry. She was a woman drowning in a house she couldn't afford with a man who didn't want to be there. She reached for the Bordeaux, a heavy bottle, dark and cold. Her hand didn't just shake, it rattled. She didn't even look at the glass as she poured. The red liquid sloshed over the rim, hitting the white linen tablecloth. It didn't look like wine. It looked like arterial spray. Deep, dark, and permanent, spreading across the fabric like a stain on a sole. Vanessa's eyes met mine for a split second. There was no love there. Just a raw, jagged panic. The panic of a person who realizes the theater is over and the curtain is falling. Standing on that porch now, I filed the intelligence away. The sabotage made sense. Vanessa didn't hate my wedding dress. She hated my freedom. She was watching her perfect life go into the industrial shredder while I, the girl who plays in the mud, was building something that wouldn't break. Marcus is a good man. He doesn't sleep at the office with a pillow. Our house is paid for. We don't owe the banks or our parents a damn cent. Vanessa couldn't stand it. She couldn't handle the sight of my stability while she was treading water. Stealing Richard's hand at the altar was nothing more than her consolation prize. It was the only scrap of power she had left, to hurt me because she couldn't save herself. Richard was just the tool she used to do it, a coward giving a consolation prize to his failing favorite. The cold Lake Erie air hit my lungs, sharp and clean. I felt the weight of their toxicity finally start to slide off my shoulders. I had spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was already rotting. Why would I want to belong to a house held together by blackmail and lies? A pair of headlights cut through the eerie fog, bright and steady. A Ford F-150, black and bruised from real work, rumbled up the gravel driveway. The engine was a low, guttural growl that made the porch floor vibrate under my boots. It was a sound of reliability, a sound of a man who showed up when he said he would. The truck door opened with a heavy metallic creak. A pair of worn work boots hit the gravel with a solid thud. I straightened my back. My chin went up, a reflex from 1,000 formations. The strong one was done being a target. The counteroffensive didn't need a dress or a father's permission. It just needed the truth. I watched the figure walk toward the porch, the silhouette strong against the gray mist. Finally, a real ally was on the perimeter. The The time for observation was over. It was time to regroup and hit back. The black Ford F-150 did not just stop. It settled into the gravel like it belonged there. The suspension gave a heavy, familiar groan as Marcus swung the door open. He did not rush. He did not offer a rehearsed smile or a pitying look. He just stood there for a second, his boots kicking up a fine layer of eerie dust, looking at me on that porch like I was a mission that needed a new set of coordinates. He climbed the steps, the wood creaking under his frame, and handed me a heavy ceramic mug. The coffee inside was black, hot enough to scald, and smelled like the only thing keeping the world from spinning off its axis. "Drink," he said. I took a sip. It burned. It was perfect. I did not look at him. I could not. My eyes were a roadmap of broken sleep and salt, raw from the Lake Erie wind and the weight of the phone calls. I sat on the edge of the porch, the cold concrete biting through my jeans. Marcus pulled up a rusted folding chair and sat opposite me, his knees nearly touching mine. He did not reach for my hand. He did not say, "It is going to be okay." He knew better. You do not tell a captain in the engineers that a collapsed bridge is going to be okay. You tell her how many tons of steel you have left. "How do you want to reset the formation?" he asked. His voice was low, a steady hum that cut through the noise in my head. "If you do not want to walk in alone, you are not walking in alone. Give me the report, Laurel." I swallowed the heat of the coffee. "The Ruiz family has officially deserted," I said. "Richard is a no-show. Donna is managing the fallout. They expect me to play the part of the modest bride and take the hit so Vanessa can keep her grandchildren as leverage. They think I am strong enough to carry the shame for them." Marcus did not blink. He just nodded once. "Understood. Change of plans. Finish your coffee. We are going to see my old man." 10 minutes later, we were moving. The truck cab smelled like old leather and sawdust. It was a clean smell, honest. We drove away from the lake, heading toward the clusters of brick warehouses and small shops where the people who actually built this town spent their days. Marcus pulled up to a corrugated metal building at the end of a dead-end street. The sign over the door was faded, just a blocky font that said, "Delaney Woodworking." The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It was thick with the scent of kiln-dried pine, cedar, and linseed oil. A shop vacuum was humming in the back, and the rhythmic, guttural growl of a wood planer filled the space. Frank Delaney was at the workbench. He was 63, but he looked like he was carved out of the very oak he worked with. His hair was a shock of white, dusted with fine sawdust, and his apron was stained with the sweat of 1,000 projects. He did not stop when we walked in. He kept his eyes on the board, his hands moving with a precision that made my engineering brain ache with respect. His knuckles were swollen, the joints thick with arthritis, and his skin was a map of old scars and permanent stains. These were the hands of a man who had built a life out of raw materials. He had not bought his way through an Ivy League or signed checks for things he could not fix. He had earned every inch of his world. I remembered the first time I met him. I'd been working on the old truck of Marcus, my arms covered in grease up to the elbows, a wrench in my hand. Frank had walked over, looked at my oil-stained palms, and nodded. "Good," he had said. "The hands of someone who knows how to work." It was the only compliment I had received in Ridgewood that did not feel like a backhanded insult. Frank flipped the switch on the planer. The silence that followed was deafening. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate, and looked at me. He did not ask why we were there. He just saw the way I was standing, back straight, chin up, heels together, and he knew the perimeter had been breached. "Richard called," I said. My voice was a thin wire, vibrating with the effort not to snap. "He is not coming. He is staying home to keep the peace for Vanessa." "He said he is tired, Frank. He said he cannot do it." I waited for the pity. I waited for him to look away, embarrassed by the raw, ugly failure of my own father. Richard had never held a hammer for me. He had never fixed a leaking faucet in my first apartment. He had never even changed my oil. He had spent his life avoiding the hard work of being a father because it was easier to let the strong one handle it. Frank did not look away. He did not sigh. He threw the rag onto the workbench and stepped closer. He smelled like sawdust and grease, a scent that felt more like home than anything I'd ever known in Ridgewood. His eyes were gray, as steady as a t-shirt on a laundry line in a storm. He looked at the scars on my hands, then up at my face. "He is a fool," Frank said. His voice was a gravelly rasp, deep and final. "A man who throws away a daughter like you does not deserve the ground he walks on." He reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. It was heavy. It was warm. It did not feel like the fragile, hesitant touch of Richard Ruiz. It felt like a foundation. "I have only ever had a son," Frank continued, his gaze never wavering. "I asked God for a daughter a long time ago, but he made me wait. I suppose he was just making sure I got the right one." I felt the first crack then. The internal beam I had been bracing for 32 years started to give way. "Frank," I whispered, "I cannot walk in there alone. Not after everything they said. Not after they made me feel like I was a tactical error." Frank Delaney did not ask for a reason. He did not ask about the drama, or the grandkids, or the crushing debt of Vanessa. He just stepped back and looked me in the eye, as solemn as a judge. "When do you need me?" The 5 words hit me harder than the betrayal. The world tilted. The strong one, the captain, the woman who had survived the desert and the dirt, finally ran out of fuel. I did not make it back to the porch. I did not even make it out of the shop. I just turned, walked to the truck, and the moment the door closed, I collapsed against the steering wheel. For the first time in 10 years, I let the engine stall. I did not just cry, I broke. And for once, I did not have to worry about the cleanup. Thursday afternoon. 48 hours to go. The Lake Erie sky had turned the color of a bruised lung, heavy and suffocating. I was in the barn, my hands moving mechanically as I sorted through a crate of white votive candles. My movements were sharp, military precise, a stark contrast to the hollow ache rattling in my ribs. I was a captain. I was an engineer. I was supposed to be the one who fixed things. But you cannot bridge a gap made of decades of cold, calculated indifference. The gravel outside crunched. Jeanette, my maid of honor, stepped into the barn. She didn't look like she was here to talk about bridesmaids' bouquets. She had her phone out, her face tight with a kind of second-hand disgust. "You need to hear what's happening in Ridgewood," she said, leaning against a stack of hay bales. "Vanessa is at the Main Street salon right now. She's got half the town listening to her." I didn't stop my work. I kept lining up the candles, making sure the rows were perfectly straight. "Let me guess. She is the victim." "She is the saint," Jeanette corrected, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "She is telling everyone that this wedding is making her physically ill. She says you are flaunting your money and your independent life just to rub her face in her divorce. She's got Donna nodding along while she gets her hair foiled. The whole town thinks you're the cold-hearted soldier who doesn't care that her sister is spiraling." I didn't flinch. I didn't throw a candle. I just looked at my hands. These were the hands that had cleared debris in flooded towns and directed heavy machinery under fire. And yet, in a high-end hair salon in Ohio, they were being painted as the hands of a bully. "Let her talk," I said. My voice was a dead flat line. Gossip doesn't hold a perimeter. Jeanette left, but the silence she left behind was louder. It was the sound of a family finishing the job of isolating me. A few hours later, as the gray light began to fail, there was another knock. Not at the barn, but at the front door of the cottage. I walked over, my boots heavy on the floorboards. Ruth was standing on the porch. She was 70, her face a map of Ohio winters, and she was wearing a thick wool coat that smelled like lavender and old Chrysler upholstery. She had been my grandmother Eleanor's best friend since before I was born. "Ruth," I said, opening the door. "It is a long drive from the next county." "2 towns," she grunted, her eyes fixed on mine. She didn't come in. She just reached into her pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. The edges were frayed, the paper slightly damp from the evening mist. "Eleanor made me swear," Ruth said, her voice like grinding stones. "She told me to hold this until the day you were backed into a corner by the people who share your blood. She knew them, Laurel. She knew them better than they know themselves." She handed me the envelope and walked back to her car without another word. A messenger who had finished a mission decades in the making. I sat at the small kitchen table. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I peeled back the dried adhesive of the envelope. It made a dry, scratchy rustle, like dead leaves. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. The smell of it hit me instantly. Musty, old, a scent of a house that no longer existed. The ink was blue, slanted, shaky. "My little Laurel," it began. I felt a lump form in my throat, a physical obstruction. Eleanor was the only one who had seen me. When I was deployed to the desert, she was the one who sent me letters every single week. My father hadn't called once. My mother hadn't even sent a care package. They had treated my service like an inconvenience, a muddy detail they didn't want to discuss at dinner parties. But Eleanor had written to me about the birds in her garden and the way the sun hit the porch, keeping me tethered to a world that was trying to forget I existed. "You were always the builder, Laurel. You build things to last because you know what it feels like when things fall apart. They won't understand that. They only like things that are wrapped in gold, even when the inside is hollow and rotting. Do not wait for them to see you. They have spent their lives looking at a mirror, not a daughter. Remember this. Real family are the people who stay in the bunker with you when the bombs are falling. If they won't stand by you in the light, they sure as hell won't be there in the dark. Be brave. Build your own house." I stared at the paper until the blue ink blurred. The strong one wasn't a label they had given me as a compliment. It was a cage they had built to keep me from asking for anything. They had used my strength as a reason to starve me of love. The guilt that had been gnawing at my gut for 48 hours, the feeling that I was destroying the family by being angry, simply evaporated. It wasn't my job to hold up a rotting roof. It was my job to get out before it collapsed on me. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the left breast pocket of my shirt, directly over my heart. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from Donna. "We decided to come to the wedding after all. We need to be there to keep up appearances. Vanessa will be in a red silk dress. Make sure you smile for the photos. We need to show everyone we are still a united front." I looked at the screen. They weren't coming as parents. They were coming as wardens. They were coming to make sure the prisoner didn't ruin the set design of their perfect, hollow life. I didn't reply. I just locked the screen. The old Laurel would have worried about the seating chart. She would have worried about the tension at the reception. But the captain, the woman Eleanor saw, knew that when an enemy tells you their move, you don't argue. You adjust your aim. The script they had written for my wedding day was dead. I was about to give them a ceremony they would never forget. The counteroffensive starts now. Friday night. The air in town tasted like hickory smoke, wet asphalt, and old exhaust. We were at Miller's Smokehouse, a local joint where the floors were sticky with spilled beer and the walls were stained by decades of grease. This was not a place for crystal flutes or five-course meals. There were no white linens here, just rolls of paper towels on every table and the heavy, honest scent of slow-burnt brisket. The room was packed. Marcus had half his construction crew there, big men with hands that looked like they were made of granite, their laughs booming against the low rafters. My old team was there too. 6 soldiers I had served with, men and women who had seen me at my worst and didn't blink. The noise was a jagged, beautiful wall of sound. The clatter of heavy trays, the rhythmic thud of the kitchen door, the sharp, metallic crack of beer cans being opened. In the middle of the chaos, at the head of the long plywood table, were 3 chairs. They were empty. I looked at those 3 spaces, 3 holes in the formation: Richard, Donna, and Vanessa. Their absence was a physical weight, a cold draft in a warm room. They had stayed away to keep the peace. They had stayed away because being seen with me was too high a price for their fragile porcelain egos. I didn't look away from the empty seats. I let the sight of them burn into my memory, a reminder of where the lines were drawn. 3 blocks away, the world was silent. Richard Ruiz sat on a blue plastic folding chair in the middle of his garage. The air was cold, smelling of damp concrete and the oil leak from his sedan that he never got around to fixing. The only light came from the small glowing screen of his phone. It cast a sickly blue hue over his face, making him look older, smaller. In his left hand, he held a tattered photo from 10 years ago. It was me, 22 years old, standing straight in my dress uniform. My eyes were full of a fire he never understood. His thumb hovered over the screen. He had typed a message. "I am sorry, Laurel. I am just tired." He stared at the words for a long minute. His finger trembled, the skin papery and thin. He looked at the kitchen door, then back at the phone. He didn't send it. He didn't have the stomach for the truth. He hit the backspace key, one letter at a time, until the screen was a blank, mocking white. He chose the quiet. He chose the coward's retreat. He folded the photo, tucked it into a drawer full of rusted tools, and sat there in the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the garage door. Back at the smokehouse, Frank Delaney stood up. The room didn't go quiet because he asked it to. It went quiet because he commanded the space. He tapped a heavy spoon against his glass of dark beer, a sharp, lawn ring that cut through the laughter. He didn't have a piece of paper. He didn't have a rehearsed speech. He just stood there, his flannel shirt dusted with the day's work, and looked at me. "I only ever had Marcus," Frank began. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like tires on a dirt road. "I used to sit on my porch and ask the Lord for a daughter. I thought he forgot about me. I thought I was just meant to raise one hard-headed builder." A few of the crew guys chuckled, but Frank didn't smile. He looked directly at me, his eyes steady as a rock. I realized later that the Lord wasn't ignoring me. He was just making me wait. He was waiting until I was old enough to appreciate a woman like Laurel. She does not need someone to protect her. She has spent her life being the shield for people who did not deserve her. But tonight and every night after, she does not have to stand alone. It is the honor of my life to call her my daughter. To Laurel. The room erupted. To Laurel. The sound of 100 glasses hitting the air was a roar of solidarity. A dut koat, thunderous noise that made the floor vibrate. I felt the letter in my breast pocket, the ink of my grandmother Eleanor, press against my skin. Frank wasn't my blood, but he was my family. He was the man who stood in the trench when the air turned cold. While the Delaneys celebrated the truth, the Ruiz house was eating itself alive. Vanessa was in the kitchen, her voice a jagged scream that carried through the walls. She was pacing the linoleum, her heels clicking like a frantic clock. Preston had called 10 minutes ago. He wasn't coming to the wedding. He was staying in the city to play golf with a client. It was a lie so thin you could see through it, but it was enough to shatter the last of Vanessa's control. "He's leaving me, Mom. He's doing this on purpose," Vanessa shrieked. She grabbed a porcelain plate from the counter and slammed it into the sink. It didn't shatter, it just cracked, a dull, sickening sound. Donna didn't hug her. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She just kept wiping the counter, her eyes vacant and hard. She was a woman obsessed with the rubble. "Stop it, Vanessa," Donna muttered. "Just put on the dress. Tomorrow, you wear the red silk. You will be the star of that room. You will make them all look at you. Do not let that girl win. Just smile and play your part." Donna was already planning the next lie. She was rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship, convinced that if the red silk was bright enough, nobody would notice the water in the hull. The rot had reached the foundation, but she was still trying to paint the walls. I stood at the edge of the smokehouse parking lot, watching the moon hang over Lake Erie. The two worlds were settled. One was built on wood, sweat, and a father who stood his ground. The other was built on shadows, red silk, and a man hiding in a dark garage. The battle lines were drawn. There was no more room for negotiation. I looked at Marcus as he walked toward me, his hand reaching for mine. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a solid weight in the dark. Tomorrow, the doors of that barn would open, and the ruins of the Ruiz family were about to find out what happens when you try to bury a soldier in the mud. They thought they were coming to a wedding. I knew we were going to a reckoning. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. The fight was coming, and I was ready. 1300 hours, Saturday. The air inside the renovated oak barn was thick, smelling of aged timber, expensive perfume, and the kind of suffocating tension that precedes a storm. 200 people packed the rows of folding chairs. Half of them were Marcus's crew and my old unit. Men in charcoal suits with thick necks and women who knew how to hold a line. The other half was Ridgewood's social elite, invited by my mother to witness what they thought would be a quiet surrender. In the very back row, tucked into the darkest corner of the barn, sat the ruins of the Ruiz family. I didn't need to look at them to know they were there. I could feel the heat of my mother's frantic, jagged energy. Donna was sitting as rigid as a frozen corpse, her knuckles white against her clutch. Next to her, Vanessa was a blood-red stain in the shadows. She had worn the red silk dress. It was tight, loud, and desperate. A neon sign screaming for attention in a room that didn't want to give it to her. She was hunched over her phone, her thumbs flying, likely checking for another excuse from Preston. And then there was Richard, my father. He was staring at his own shoes, his shoulders slumped, trying to make himself small enough to disappear into the wood grain. They were waiting. They were all waiting to see me walk through those doors alone, a solitary figure of shame they could later pity over dinner. The light in the barn shifted. The chatter died a sudden, violent death. A single cello string pulled a low, mournful note that vibrated in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't a wedding march. It was a cadence. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the barn swung open. The afternoon sun poured in, a blinding white flood that turned the dust motes into shards of glass. I stood on the threshold. I wasn't the girl who had cried against the steering wheel 48 hours ago. I was a captain. My back was a steel rod. My chin was level with the horizon. I didn't wear a veil to hide behind. My eyes were clear, scanning the room like a radar sweeping for targets. And I wasn't alone. I felt the solid, unyielding weight of Frank Delaney's arm under mine. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked like it was made of armor. He stood there like an old oak tree that had weathered a century of Lake Erie winters. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He just looked straight ahead, his jaw set in a line of granite. We began to move. Step, step, step. It wasn't a stroll. It was a march. The rhythmic thud of our heels on the hardwood floorboards sounded like the beat of a drum. It was a heavy, decisive sound. Every time my heel hit the floor, I felt another piece of the Ruiz's power over me shatter. As we passed the middle rows, the shift happened. One by one, the veterans from my unit stood up. They didn't smile. They didn't whisper. They stood at attention, their backs straight, their eyes fixed on me with a respect that Richard Ruiz had never even tried to earn. Then Marcus's crew followed. A sea of big, rough-handed men standing in silence. The eyes of the room didn't stay on me. They swept like a searchlight toward the back corner, toward the man who was supposed to be in Frank's place. Richard Ruiz looked like he was having a stroke. His face went from a dull gray to a sickly, translucent white. He staggered. He actually swayed in his seat, his hand clutching the velvet edge of the pew like he was trying to keep the floor from rising up to hit him. His mouth hung open, a small, pathetic hole of disbelief. He looked at me, then at Frank, then at the 200 people watching his cowardice being put on a pedestal. Vanessa froze. Her phone actually slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a plastic clatter that sounded like a bone breaking. Her eyes were wide, her mouth twisted in a mask of pure, jagged envy. She had come to watch a funeral. She was witnessing a coronation. We reached the altar. The air was cold here, away from the sun. Marcus was waiting, his eyes burning with a pride that made my heart ache. The minister stepped forward, his voice clearing the last of the silence. He asked the question, the one Richard had spent 30 years preparing to fail. Who gives this woman away? The silence stretched. It was a jagged thing, cutting into the lungs of everyone in the room. I looked at Richard. He was shaking. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the push. Frank Delaney didn't turn his head. He didn't look back at the back row. He didn't give Richard the satisfaction of his gaze. He took a breath, his chest expanding, and his voice came out like a thunderclap. It was deep, it was gravelly, it was final. Her family. He didn't say, I do. He said, her family. Two words that stripped Richard of his title, his rights, and his history in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. It was a firing squad made of two words. If you've ever reached the point where you realize that your real family doesn't share your DNA, I want to hear from you. Hit the like button right now if you felt that chill when Frank spoke. Comment, her family below, to show your support for every person who had to build their own house from the ruins of an old one. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The fallout from this execution is just beginning, and you don't want to miss how I handle the aftermath in the reception hall. Richard's knees gave out. He slumped back into the chair, his head dropping into his hands. He was a ghost, a deserter caught in the open. Frank squeezed my hand once, a solid, rough-palmed promise, and stepped back. He had done more for me in 40 steps than Richard had done in 30 years. I turned to Marcus. The mission was accomplished. The old world was dead. And now I was going to enjoy the silence of its collapse. I took Marcus's hand. His skin was warm. Real. Behind us, I heard the sound of my mother sobbing. Not for me, but for the shame of being seen. The battle was over. The occupation had begun. The reception was a riot of noise that did not reach my gut. The air inside the barn had shifted from the heavy, suffocating silence of the ceremony to a roar of blue-collar celebration. Marcus's crew was already 3 pitchers deep into the local amber ale. My old unit had taken over a corner table, their laughter sounding like gravel in a blender. But the Her family line still hung in the rafters like a low-voltage hum. It was the ghost at the feast. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard the sound of Richard Ruiz being stripped of his rank in front of his own town. I stood by the dessert table. The wedding cake was a massive, 3-tiered beast covered in white buttercream. It looked too perfect for a place like this. It looked like a lie. I picked up the silver cake knife. It was heavy in my hand, the metal cold against my palm. I ran my thumb along the flat of the blade. It was sharp enough to do the job. I felt Richard before I saw him. He did not walk over like a father. He approached like a man trying to cross a minefield without a map. He smelled of tobacco and the sour, sharp scent of cold sweat. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the white frosting, my back a solid wall between him and the rest of my life. I could hear his breathing, shallow, hitching, the sound of a man who had run out of excuses and was now trying to negotiate with the wreckage. "Laurel," he whispered. His voice was thin, a pathetic rasp that had no business in a room full of real men. I did not answer. I did not even blink. I just stood there, a stone in the middle of his storm. "That man, Delaney," Richard said, his voice gaining a desperate, fake warmth. He was trying to play the part of the magnanimous elder, trying to pretend that he had allowed the humiliation to happen. He did a fine job, I suppose. It was an interesting choice. People are talking, of course, but I told them it was just your way of being different. You were always the independent one. I slowly turned my head. I did not look at his face. I looked at the tie he was wearing, a silk thing that cost more than a month of my combat pay. I shifted my gaze upward until I locked onto his eyes. There was no anger in me. Anger requires energy. And I was not going to waste a single watt on him. I looked at him with the clinical, detached gaze of an officer evaluating a piece of faulty equipment. I drove the silver knife into the center of the cake. The blade slid through the sponge and cream with a sickening, soft resistance. "Are you sorry because you missed the walk, Richard?" I asked. My voice was low, a dead flat line that cut through his fake smile. "Or are you just sorry because 200 people saw you sitting in the shadows like a coward while another man did your job?" Richard recoiled like I had struck him with a closed fist. He actually took a half step back, his mouth hanging open, his face turning a blotchy, uneven red. He looked around the room, terrified that someone had heard the truth. I had to stay with your sister," he stammered. "She was in a state, Laurel. You do not understand the pressure. She is fragile." "She is a parasite," I said. "And you are the host, but I am done being the blood supply." Donna appeared then, scurrying out of the crowd like a bird of prey. She grabbed Richard by the elbow, her fingers digging into his suit jacket. Her face was a mask of strained politeness, but her eyes were darting around the room, calculating the social damage. "Do not make a scene, Laurel," Donna hissed through her teeth. "People are watching. We are a family. We can fix this later, but for now, you need to act like a daughter. Think about the reputation of this house." I looked at her, then at him. I gave them a smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of a person who had already moved out and changed the locks. "I am not making a scene, Mother," I said, my voice as cold as Lake Erie in January. "I am just cutting the cake. You are the ones standing in the way of the blade." I turned my back on them. I did not look back. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I focused entirely on Marcus, who was walking toward me with a clean plate. I leaned into him, letting the warmth of a real man erase the chill of the ruins behind me. They were gone. In my mind, they were already gray ghosts, static on a radio I'd finally turned off. This was the gray rock. I gave them nothing. No tears, no shouting, no satisfaction. I simply made them invisible. Across the room, the punishment of Vanessa was being handled by the heavy hitters. I saw Ruth, my grandmother's friend, stop by the table where Vanessa was nursing a glass of wine. Ruth did not shout. She just leaned down and said something quiet, her eyes hard as flint. "Your grandmother would be proud of Laurel, Vanessa," Ruth said, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "She would be proud of anyone who had the courage to be happy despite people like you." Vanessa's face went white. She snatched her designer bag, her sharp heels clicking frantically against the hardwood as she fled toward the restroom. She stayed in there for 20 minutes, hiding in a stall, while the party went on without her. At exactly 1700 hours, the Ruiz formation broke. I watched from the corner of my eye as the three of them, Richard, Donna, and the red silk stain that was Vanessa, slipped out the back service door. They did not say goodbye. They did not look at the lights. They just hurried to the parking lot, their heads down, fleeing the scene of their own execution. They were crushed, and I had not had to fire a single shot. I took a bite of the cake. It was sweet. It was finally, truly sweet. But as I watched their taillights fade into the Ohio mist, I realized the fallout was far from over. A coward who has been publicly shamed is a dangerous thing, and Richard Ruiz still had one more card to play before he disappeared into the dark. I looked at Marcus. "It is done," I said. He nodded, but he knew what I knew. The bridge was blown. Now we had to see who was left standing on the other side. 800 hours. Tuesday. 2 weeks had passed since the dust settled in the oak barn. The morning air at the construction site was a cold, biting gray, smelling of wet topsoil, diesel fumes, and the sharp tang of curing concrete. I stood in the center of the future Veterans Hospital healing garden, my leather work boots caked in thick, orange mud. Above me, the boom of a yellow excavator groaned as it swung a load of dark earth. I did not look at the sky. I looked at the grade of the soil. I looked at the work that needed to be finished. My phone vibrated against my thigh. It was a jagged, persistent rhythm that cut through the low hum of the machinery. I pulled it out. The caller ID said Vanessa. I did not answer it immediately. I watched the excavator dump its load. A heavy thud of dirt hit the ground, vibrating through the soles of my feet. I slid my thumb across the screen and held the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I just waited. The sound that came through the speaker was not the voice of the Ivy League graduate I grew up with. It was not the sharp, condescending tone of the woman in the red silk dress. It was the sound of a person who had finally run out of floorboards to stand on. Vanessa was sobbing, a wet, gasping sound that came in ragged bursts. "He's gone, Laurel," she choked out. Her voice was thin, stripped of all its armor. "Preston, he packed his bags last night. He's in Chicago with a girl from his firm. He emptied the joint account. He did not even leave a note for the kids. He just vanished." I stared at a pile of gravel. I felt nothing. No surge of joy, no rush of pity, just a cold, clinical observation of a structure that was never built to survive a storm. The golden couple was dust. The finance bro had traded the trophy wife for a newer model. And the house of cards had finally collapsed. "I have nothing," Vanessa wailed. "The house is in his name. The cars are leased through the company. Mom will not stop crying. She is worried about what the neighbors will say when the repo man shows up. Laurel, please, I do not know what to do. I am scared. I shifted my weight, the mud sucking at my boots. I did not offer a shoulder. I did not offer a spare room. I watched a worker guide the excavator with hand signals. Precise, controlled. Why are you calling me, Vanessa? I asked. My voice was a flat line of concrete. There was a long silence on the other end, broken only by her hitching breath. I was jealous, she whispered. The confession sounded like it was being pulled out of her chest with a hook. I hated you. I hated that you were out there in the mud, in the middle of nowhere, but you were real. I hated that Marcus looked at you like you were a queen even when you were covered in grease. I spent my whole life trying to be perfect so people would look at me. But nobody ever saw me. Preston only saw a decoration. You had a man who would stand up to a father for you. I had a man who would not even look up from his phone when I was bleeding. She paused, a jagged sob catching in her throat. I tried to ruin your wedding because it was the only way I could feel powerful. I wanted to see you fail because I was already failing. I am sorry. Please. I need help. I looked at the shovel leaning against the fence. I thought about the letters Grandma Eleanor sent to the desert. I thought about the empty chairs at the rehearsal dinner. I hope you find what you are looking for, Vanessa, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not let the anger back in. But I cannot be your life jacket, not when you were the one trying to hold my head under the water. You chose your path. You chose the red dress and the lies. Now you have to live in the house you built. Do not call this number again. I did not wait for her response. I did not listen to the next wave of sobs. I tapped the red icon. I blocked the contact. I put the phone back in my pocket and picked up a shovel. The rhythm of the work was the only thing that mattered. Scrape, lift, thud, scrape, lift, thud. I cleared the debris until the sun finally broke through the gray. 3 days later, a thick manila envelope arrived in my mailbox at the cottage. There was no return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was the shaky, uneven script of a man who had spent his life avoiding the truth. I sat on the porch and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of yellow legal paper. No legal documents, no checks. Just a letter from Richard Ruiz. Laurel, it read. I watched you walk down that aisle with Frank Delaney. I saw the way the room looked at you, and I saw the way they looked at me. I have spent my entire life trying to avoid being uncomfortable. I thought if I just stayed quiet, the problems would go away. I was a coward. I let Vanessa treat you like dirt because it was easier than standing up to her. I let your mother turn you into a stranger because I did not want to argue at dinner. I felt the paper beneath my calloused fingers. It felt thin, pathetic. Frank Delaney did not just take my place at the altar, the letter continued. He picked up the daughter I was too weak to keep. He did the job I was too afraid to do. I have always been proud of you, Laurel. I just did not have the guts to say it when it mattered. I am sorry. Your father, Richard. I read the words twice. I did not feel a release. I did not feel the closure they talk about in the movies. An apology that comes after the defeat is just another form of surrender. He was not sorry for what he did to me. He was sorry that he had been caught in the open without a shield. I walked into the house. I opened the bottom drawer of the antique desk in the hallway. I pulled out the envelope from Grandma Eleanor, the blue ink, the shaky hand of a woman who actually loved me. I took Richard's letter, folded it once, and placed it underneath hers. I did not write back. I did not call him. I simply closed the drawer. The investigation was over. The file was closed. The ruins of the Ruiz family were no longer my responsibility to rebuild. I walked into the kitchen where Marcus was brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The smell was rich, warm, and grounded. Everything okay? He asked, his hand finding the small of my back. Yeah, I said, leaning into his strength. The site is clear. The foundation is set. I looked out the window at the lake. The water was dark, but the horizon was starting to glow. I was no longer a daughter of the ruins. I was a builder, and the house I was standing in was finally mine. The war was over. I had won the peace. 0, 900 hours. Saturday morning. The edge of the suburbs was quiet, the kind of silence you only find when the neighbors are minding their own business and the world has finally stopped screaming for your attention. Inside my garage, the air was thick with the scent of linseed oil and the sharp metallic tang of the tool bench. Marcus was standing at the pegboard, his back to me, organizing a set of heavy wrenches. There was no shouting here, there was no demand for attention. There were no fake smiles to keep up for the sake of a social circle that did not care if we lived or died. This garage was the first piece of the life I had built with my own hands. Every wrench, every bolt, and every gallon of paint had been paid for with honest work, not with the hollow promises of a family that had spent 30 years trying to drown me. The silence was not empty. It was full of the rhythmic, solid sounds of a life being constructed, the click of a steel peg into the board, the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the steam rising from 2 mugs of black coffee that did not need sugar to be palatable. This was the piece I had won on the battlefield of my own history. I stood there, my back straight and my chin level, looking at the layout of the workshop. I was not a daughter looking for a place to hide. I was a builder looking for a place to create. The sound of gravel signaled the arrival. It was a heavy, crunching noise, the signature of a truck that worked as hard as the person driving it. The black Ford F-150 pulled up to the driveway, the engine giving one last, satisfied growl before it cut out. The door opened with a metallic creak that I had come to respect. Frank Delaney stepped out. He was wearing an old, faded ball cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He did not knock on the doorframe. He just walked into the garage, his boots thudding against the concrete floor with a weight that felt like a foundation. He was carrying something heavy, wrapped in a shop rag that was stained with the work of a dozen different projects. He did not say hello. He did not ask how we were settling in. He walked straight to my workbench and placed the object down with a solid, wooden thud. I stepped forward and pulled the fabric back. It was a cutting board. But that word did not do it justice. It was a slab of wild cherry wood, inlaid with borders of dark walnut. It was 3 inches thick, heavy enough to be a weapon, and sanded until it felt like silk under my fingertips. The wood glowed with a deep, honey-colored light, the result of hours of hand-rubbed linseed oil. "For the new kitchen," Frank said. His voice was a low rasp, short and final. He did not give a speech. He did not need to. The board told the story. It was a piece of craftsmanship that was built to survive the decades. It was honest. It was sturdy. It was a gift that came from the sweat of a man who knew what it meant to provide. I ran my hand over the smooth grain, feeling the cool temperature of the wood. I looked at Frank. His hands were rough, his knuckles swollen from years of holding a saw and a hammer. He had spent his Saturday morning driving 40 minutes across the county just to bring me this. A sudden, sharp truth cut through my mind like a saw through pine. I thought about Richard Ruiz. I thought about the man who lived only 40 steps away from the altar and yet could not find the courage to walk them. I thought about the letters he sent after he had already lost the war. Richard was a man of paper and shadows. Frank was a man of wood and steel. DNA does not create a father. Loyalty does. A father is the man who shows up when the trenches are filling with water. A father is the man who builds a table instead of burning the house down. I turned to the counter and poured a 3rd mug of coffee. I handed it to Frank, our fingers brushing against the ceramic. There was no tension. There was no hidden agenda. Just the shared respect of 2 people who knew how to build things that stayed standing. I looked at Marcus, who was leaning against the tool wall with a quiet, knowing smile. Then I turned my gaze toward you. If you are sitting at a table where they serve you nothing but disrespect, do not argue. Do not beg for a seat. Just stand up and walk out the door. You do not owe your life to a shadow just because you share a name. You have the right to leave. You have the right to build your own house, your own rules, and your own family. Look at the people who stand in the bunker with you when the bombs are falling. Those are your people. Those are the ones who deserve a place at your table. If you are stuck in a house that makes you feel small, remember this. You are the one with the hammer. You are the one with the blueprint. You can start building today. If this journey has meant something to you, if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic bridge to save your own life, I want to hear about it. Hit the like button if you are proud of the table you have built. Comment, build your own below to let me know you are still standing. Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay with us as we continue to tell the stories that the shadows try to hide.